Welcome back to the Spe Salvi Institute Podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin with Bobby Mixa. Bobby, how are you?
Good, Andrew. It's good to see you. It's just post-Easter, so happy Easter.
Yeah, happy Easter. And, you know, the day after Easter, Easter Monday, we woke up to the surprise, kind of, that our Holy Father, Pope Francis, had died. He had not been very well for a long time, but he was in the hospital for a long time and then came out and seemed to be out and about on Easter Sunday. And then we woke up and he died. And here we are several days after that event, and we're still in this transition phase. So this podcast that we want to make today is going to be timely, but like all of our conversations, we hope there will be plenty in it to carry forward even beyond the kind of moment that we're living in right now. And to help us along here, to have this conversation about Pope Francis, and we're going to call this something of a critical appreciation, I think, Bobby. We have our friend Nathan Pinkoski joining us again. Nathan, how are you?
Thank you very much for having me. It's good to be here. Happy Easter.
Yeah, happy Easter. Yeah, it's great to have you back. And the occasion for having you back was not only because we're just eager to talk to you again, but we really appreciated the piece that you published in Compact. You must have had it locked and loaded, I'm guessing, for the Pope's death, because it came out right after he died. You can tell us about that, but I'll just tell our audience what it's called. It's called Pope Francis's Managerial Revolution. And before I throw it to you, Nathan, I just want to read this one thing. Another writer for Compact, Stephen Adubato, he tweeted out your piece favorably, and Stephen, I think, is a fan of Pope Francis. But here's what he said when he shared your piece, which I think our audience will find pretty interesting. He writes, "From a purely spiritual point of view, I strongly believe the Francis papacy was a net positive for the Church. But from an administrative point of view, there were issues which were glossed over by the media and which Nathan Pinkoski articulates very well." Again, the piece is called Pope Francis's Managerial Revolution. So tell us about how you came to write this piece, Nathan.
Well, I wish I could say I'd had it locked and loaded. I might have been able to have had the prose a little cleaned up there. It was actually just it's some ideas I had floating around in my head before, but the editor of Compact, he sent me a text when the news came. So it would have been just woken up and said, "Would you like to write something?" And I immediately shot back a vague idea and thought, "Oh, actually, that might work," which turned out to be the Managerial Revolution. So it was one of these fast, rapid-fire, journalistic shooting from the hip a bit. But the muse must have inspired me, because there was a couple things I was thinking about that came together very well as I was putting it together, and then. I've received many compliments, I think, from people who were both very critical of the papacy, but those who were supportive and generally favorable along the lines that you noted. So I think it was if you will, a fresh take that hadn't been articulated before that spoke well to it. And I think to go to what the comment there might have touched on, I think it's something that you had to look or be thinking about, and you look a little bit beneath what the normal media portrayals were, but also I think the Catholic commentary as well, which was often, I think I have a couple examples in mind, but just to be quick here about getting the key idea out here. I think there was a lot of really ambitious administrative reforms that went into effect, and the usual way that they might get discussed would be something like, "Oh, look, there's more laity involved. Are we worried that there are going to be people exercising authority in the juridical authority in the church who are not of a clerical background?" And then you kind of say that's a good thing or that's a bad thing. But what often got passed over was just how the structure and the way that the Vatican was operating was changing. And that's where I thought that actually the insight of thinking about this in terms of managerialism might help us understand what was going on. And just to say what you said at the start there, to ensure that that it's a critical treatment, but there's also an appraisal as well, right, of the Francis papacy and the way that I was coming at this. It's hard to find, I think. I can't think offhand, at least in magisterial thought, a pope who was so eloquent and wrote so lengthily on the technocratic paradigm. It's there in Benedict's writings, of course, and especially when he was still a theologian, he's very, very good on that theme. But in terms of magisterial thought, it's hard to find someone who is so eloquent and wrote at such a protracted length on those topics. And yet the paradox, or perhaps the tragedy, of the Francis papacy is that many of the style of governance, many of the actions seem to embody that very thing that he was so good in speech, so good in his writings, criticizing. He seemed to embody that in practice.
Yeah, Nathan, because you're the title of your piece, Pope Francis's Managerial Revolution. It's nice because first the first or the second paragraph, you define managerialism as managerialism is at its core the prioritization of process over product. Optimizing process means that objective, concrete outcomes are subordinated to a particular state of mind. Could you say, in kind of conjunction with the technocratic stuff, because you hear a lot of people saying, oh, Pope Francis, oftentimes critiqued authoritarianism, but yet was kind of somewhat authoritarian himself. But here it seems like you're kind of coming at it a little bit differently. So could you maybe explain a little bit more, what's going on with bringing in managerialism and kind of connecting that up with Francis?
Yeah, exactly. Well, look, I see that managerialism is one of the great ideologies that develops in the latter part of the 20th century, and I don't think we should just subsume it under the label of capitalism or socialism or communism. It's actually a whole different practice that takes off in Western society and then gets globalized kind of at the end of let's say the 80s, and the 90s is really the point where it takes off. And I think the word authoritarian distracts from a lot of what we're talking about here with managerialism. I think the phenomenon that I'm thinking about is the phenomenon of doublespeak, of running a business or running a kind of an office place where it's not exactly clear what tangible goals, what you're accomplishing on a regular basis. You're given tasks that seem arbitrary, tasks that seem unclear, and you can be on very good rapport with your manager, with your boss, who'll be very amiable and about that. But there's a lot of passing the buck. There's a hesitancy for one person to come and direct you and say, this is what needs to be done. I want you to do this. If you don't do this, here are the penalties. There's a hesitancy to do that. So you end up adopting, on the one hand, this very amiable approach with your colleagues or with your boss, or the boss to the supervisor to the employees, and yet on the other hand, you sort of have a sense, if you're in these workplaces, you have a sense that something's off. If someone doesn't like you, you can be punished for that. If the standards change, there's going to be some kind of punishment, and it's just unclear where that penalty comes from. And it's that diffusion, I think, of personal responsibility that you have in the managerial setting. And what I thought the connection here to a lot of what happened with under the Francis papacy is I think that people took a couple examples of the way he was exercising juridical power in controversial ways, like what he did with the Order of Malta, which was in many respects unprecedented. The challenges that were placed upon Catholics who wanted to participate in the Latin Mass. Those were examples of the Pope exercising in a controversial manner his juridical power, and we can debate about whether that was appropriate, whether that was abusive, whether he even has some of the power with the liturgical matters, what he can actually abrogate. But that wasn't the whole story of governance. And I think in a lot of the situations, what was going on was a sense that was a lot of vagueness, a lot of confusion, and the lack of clarity was often a way to exacerbate that kind of thing. And for a managerial setting, that's exactly how they operate. That's exactly how you proceed when you're not held to a particular tangible task, when there's a kind of atmosphere, well, let's just be nice or kind and sort of keep punting off on the decisions or the hard punitive aspects. And I thought that kind of atmosphere may have described a lot of what was going on, at least when you move away from the immediate the lightning rod events like trying to ban the Latin Mass or severely abrogate it. So that was sort of what I was thinking, is that kind of managerialism, that not abrogation, diffusion of personal responsibility was a big part of it. And I guess I see this, to give one example of how this can play out. A lot of the things that got labeled pastoral dimensions, or were seen as a way to enhance the pastoral theology. You think, on the one hand, well, this is just getting people to make more decisions about how they run their parish, and this is what the spirit of the Francis papacy is supposed to be. But I think when you look more closely at a lot of that, it was people saying, well, Pope Francis has said this, therefore I can do this, or Pope Francis hasn't said that this is what it is, so I can do this. So there was a kind of spirit of throwing up one's hands and saying, well, look, someone else has made the decision. All I'm doing is applying it. And then if you go up to the top level, then it would be, well, no, I've never said that, or there'd be an ambiguity about it, or the I don't remember kind of commentary. And that's the managerial dynamic. No one wants to take responsibility for what is going on. Everyone is shuffling off the accountability to someone else.
I want to. There's so many good ideas, so many good thoughts in your piece. I just, for my sake, I wanted to back up just a second and think about maybe how this developed in Francis's papacy. Because I do want to acknowledge, and you've already done this, Nathan, but I want to just acknowledge for myself that I think Laudato Si is quite a good document. And when I first read it in 2015, before I was even Roman Catholic, it encouraged me in a way. And I really wasn't that familiar with what Pope Benedict and or even John Paul II had said about matters of technology and kind of, the kind of oppressiveness of systems and things like that. I was very ignorant about a lot of those things. So Laudato Si was very eye-opening for me, and I still consider it to be an important document. However, 5 years later, and Bobby, you may remember this, when Bobby and I were working at Word on Fire, we read Fratelli Tutti, the encyclical that came out 5 years after Laudato Si, and we were tasked with making a video where we sort of were called to sort of explain it, and we did, and I mean, I think we tried to find as much as we could appreciate in that document. But I was rereading it again this week, and actually sort of in preparation for talking to you today, and I was really knocked out by how the language shifted. There was still a lot of the kind of critique of technocracy there, but I was really overwhelmed with how it read so much more like just something that was like a sort of world, globalist UN sort of thing. Like, in other words, it seemed to me kind of dripping with the kind of jargon of the very thing, and you've already said this, but sort of the very thing that Pope Francis seemed to be critiquing earlier. And now I don't know if that was because of some specific circumstances. So it came out in 2020. He acknowledges COVID. It's very clear that the first Trump administration is having an effect on him or those who are helping him write this document or whatever. The migration crisis in Europe has taken on sort of a whole new life in the 5 years from when he wrote Laudato Si. And suddenly there's all this anti-populist stuff. There's all this anti-nationalist stuff. There's tons of language of human rights, And so I don't know. I'm just wondering, when in your mind does this shift happen where, was it sort of always there from the beginning, or do you, like me, sort of see this marked change?
Yeah, no, look, I do see that marked change, but I guess and I think a lot of it is in response to events in the U.S. Yes, the events in Europe, the migration crisis as it starts off, but I think as it starts off in 2015. But I really think that in that case it was the mark of the shift in U.S. politics. So this wasn't just going to be some kind of
Mm-hmm.
passing concern about migration, the occasional moments that had happened in Europe. They've basically been going on since the 70s, where you'd have concerns about this, you'd have protests, you might have the populists would do well in one electoral cycle. But U.S. politics changed a lot, I think. But look, I do think there was a tendency from the start, but I wouldn't. What I would say is it's not so much about looking in Laudato Si for tensions or something like that. Although one could certainly do that. But like you, I think there's a lot to be appreciated in that document for its philosophical seriousness, its earnestness to try to articulate a problem in ways that hadn't yet been articulated before. But I'd see it as a contrast between two approaches. One was the approach of Laudato Si, and then the other approach would be the approach that happened a few months later with Amoris Laetitia, wherein what was going on there was a document that was constructed in a deliberately ambiguous way, nodding and winking towards propositions that were heterodox. And there was an opportunity to clarify that, and the decision was made not to clarify it, to leave it as it stood. And that's the side of managerialism that I think fascinates me. And I think there are two levels one could engage on this. One is the level, and many people have done this, of course, the purely doctrinal level, which is to say, look at this, look at the way it's been written. Is this in tension with what the church has taught before? Here are the ways it is in tension, and let's examine that. But there's another way to ask about the kind of ethic or norm that is associated with that, and this is where I see the managerial approach to be part of it, where you're deliberately vague, where you're kind of adopting this ethic of which I think is described very very well as conspicuous compassion. Where what you're trying to do is you're trying to leave some difficult or controversial positions unspoken, or leave the language open-ended. Not necessarily, I think people do this all the time with good intentions, right? Not necessarily because you're in Christian circles, because you're a heretic, but because it's the safer, nicer thing to do. It's the way that opens you up to bringing more people together. It's a diplomatic tactic. It's a tactic for negotiations. You do this all the time in the office place, where you have bosses or supervisors who, as I was alluding to at the start, issue very vague reviews or very vague performance standards. And that kind of cultivates a much more generalistic ethic. But I think what happens as you start going down that path is, you lose objectivity. In the theological setting, right? There's a certain catastrophe there. In the workplace setting, you're just not clear what you're supposed to be doing at work anymore. And that opens it up to all kinds of potentially arbitrary decisions. If you have a boss with a particular personality who's determined to, who just likes to be in control, right? And that can spin out in very pernicious ways. If you have someone who is of a particular ideological set, then that becomes to define the whole office place. Everyone has to match up in that. If you have one who's just not a very good boss, chaos reigns, right? There's a lot of possibilities there. But the important thing is that there is a reason why that kind of managerialism is popular, and the reason why it starts the reason why it's seductive and pulls people in. And what we have to see, I think, is that it's not just a way of running an office place, but it is a way of life. And it's taken over. Many, if not most, Western institutions define themselves in this way. And what seemed to be going on in the past decade was, if one could discuss a number of different reasons for it, but it did increasingly define the way that church officials thought of themselves and the way they interacted with each other and with the world.
Yeah, Nathan, I'm thinking of Alistair McIntyre's book After Virtue, because he has a section in there. I forget the name of the title, and I don't have the book on me. It's up in it's in some box somewhere. I haven't fully unpacked, but he has a section where he talks about the kind of like, I don't know if it's the three defining archetypes of our age, in which he talks about what the two of them are: the manager and the therapist. And in some ways, you can kind of, at least in my experience, you can kind of combine the two of them, because oftentimes in the office space, they'll also be asking like, well, how are you feeling? And you feel like your managers, when you go have meetings, sometimes you feel like it's sometimes a therapy session, and almost too personal, where you should, instead of sitting at a table, should be sitting on a couch. So I mean, could you possibly say something about that? Because it seems that, like, which you're saying with always kind of, handing off the responsibility to somebody else. And this kind of lines up too with technocracy, with some of the like observations of somebody like a Jacques Ellul, where it seems like there is no like responsible agent anymore. And like you said, and maybe this is too much, but your comment on the dicastery for communication and spending the most money there, or as much as it's spent at the Secretary of State, is really interesting, because it seems that, like, and this is another point, which is like appearing is more important than what is the case. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. No, but I think the movement of the two together, for McIntyre, I just was trying to see if I can find the section here you're referring to. But the movement between the manager and the therapist, I think the way that they come together is something like this: is that the manager, at least in the initial formulation, of the formulation that McIntyre is thinking about, is someone who's concerned with neutrality, someone who's concerned with just give me the means to achieve this particular end. And the therapist is the ethic, provides the ethic. And the two merge together, I think. I think Matthew Crawford describes this very well in his book, Shopclass Soulcraft, which is really a reflection on managerialism versus working with your hands, the subjectivity of managerialism versus the objectivity of craftsmanship. But what happens is that the two come together. And therefore the ethic of the office place becomes one whereby, instead of talking actually about specific, if it's about professional conduct or about specific criteria that you need to meet in your job, they don't want to talk about that. But instead it's sort of like, are you happy here? Is this the right place for you? It's that the kind of substitution for performance, and that's the thing that Matthew Crawford he hates and points out. But I think what we have to bear in mind is a neutral workplace, the neutrality setup. And I think this is a bit of McIntyre's point, but I'm kind of extrapolating more generally, that's not a stable position. What does it get filled with is the issue, the question, and the language of therapy or life coach. Is a way that this gets filled up. So managerialism in practice, maybe there was a different time whereby the manager was just concerned with the bottom line. But I actually think that when you look closely, it's hard to find that you usually see other kinds of concerns come into play pretty fast. So. I didn't write it about in this piece, but just to give a kind of example of the practice of what managerialism looks like, I think we sometimes have this debate as to whether DEI is really just a set of corporate interests about making profit, or whether it's the other way around, or the people who are interested in profit are really just at the service of the ideology. And so if you press the former thesis that it's all just in service of profit, you're usually looking for who are the big corporations that benefit from this, and you're trying to trace out a network that shows these are the big ones that gain from this. These are the people who gain from it. And then if you do it the other way, it's all about the ideology. And you're like, where did this ideology come from? And then you're writing books on cultural Marxism or the Frankfurt School or this kind of stuff. And I actually think that there might be a lot of value in doing either of those approaches, but we can just recognize that both of them come together. Just as you might value making a profit, you can also value at the same time the diversity, equity, inclusion stuff. That both are values that get pulled together and are often aligned very well. In fact, now that I think about it, I was looking the other day at some consulting companies, and their slogans that they use when they're talking about this was always to say the policy, the whatever it might be, the diversity policy, and it's good for business. So the two are almost interchangeable. Like you bring the two together. But the point being that managerialism has an ethic built into it, and it's exactly what you were saying. It's this kind of ethic of this therapeutic ethic, the focus on one's internal state. The thing that McIntyre is deeply concerned about, the emotivist element of this, where we lose our capacity to rationally adjudicate and criticize other moral positions, that drops out of the way. This is a big part of the landscape. And the last thing I'll say there just quickly on McIntyre too is when we're talking about the managers, we're not talking about people who exercise power in a brilliant manner, people who are virtuosos in their capacity to use it well. To go back a little bit to what you said at the start about the authoritarian concern in many ways. Is related to that. That when managerialism runs an organization, when it takes over an organization, we're not necessarily dealing with high levels of competence or skill. It, as they say, right, as the kids say, right, everything becomes mid. That's just what happens. And that, I think, describes a lot of the way things have been run recently in the church, or this is certainly the perception that a lot of faithful Catholics have, the frustration.
Yeah, and Nathan, I think we would all agree that most of our institutions are pretty mediocre nowadays, and so we're seeing this everywhere. And I guess this is part of my wonder, I suppose, about your perspective here on Pope Francis, kind of ushering in this managerial age. Because on the one hand, it seems to me this going along with this managerialism, like Francis's style was definitely suited to it. Because some people have sort of called him like a Peronist or something. Like it seems like his style is keep everybody guessing all the time. And that's sort of the way that you exercise power. I mean, maybe I don't understand Peronism exactly, but I'm given to understand there's something to that about that style. But as you note, it was under Francis that the Vatican now has an HR department, and it wasn't under Benedict, it wasn't under John Paul II. It's going to be. This will be part of Francis's legacy, right? And as you note at the beginning of your piece, it will be hard to undo a lot of these things. But something that I've noticed working in churches and religious institutions and stuff is that this stuff is now everywhere, and I think it wasn't because the Pope did it that everybody else started doing it. You know what I mean? So, even not only dioceses, but even a large parish church in suburban America may have an HR department, and so I guess what I'm getting at here is just trying to wrap my head around like how it all, what's the chicken and egg part here? How do we go forward now that this stuff is just so pervasive?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and it's very hard. And look, and to speak in defense of some of it too, right? If you work in British churches, you deal with safeguarding. What does that mean? It's child safeguarding. Processes that have developed in order to ensure the safety of children, partly to do with the legacy of the Abu scandal. But in that situation, in Britain, I speak for the British example here. The church there was very, very good at developing rules, best practices, if you will, that were in a way ahead of what other institutions were developing that were slower at that. Now, some of this, of course, you have to ask what the limits and the boundaries are of it. I think it's just important for people to see in the Christian world, right? The ministry of the priest. I think really the ministry of anyone in the church is going to involve touching. To give an example, what I mean here is people will need hugs. People will need support. They need to have that kind of at times a physical connection. And if your rule was no touching at all, then you run into these situations whereby, and I've seen it in a couple parishes, not in Britain but elsewhere, where you see the priest is in a very hard situation whereby he's supposed to be the father. You have young children running to him because they're happy to see him, and they want to give him a hug, and they're giving him a hug, and he doesn't know what to do because of the concerns. And that's a situation where we need to ensure, first of all, that we understand that when you're playing the role of the father, when you are a spiritual father, you're going to have to be doing some things like that. There's, of course, a context where it can be done, perhaps other settings where that should be avoided. But writing the rules well, writing the best practices well to accommodate that aspect is going to be as important, and just as important as actually having a set of rules. Again, the safeguarding or best practices that you might think on a few occasions might roll your eyes and be like, well, do we really need all this? And the answer is probably yes. It's far better, at least in the present situation, but also just proceeding forward to ensure that what had happened in the past doesn't happen again. Erring on that side is probably the better way to go. And adopting managerialism in that setting, where what you're doing is if you have people who are like, well, why can't we just do things like this? And you kind of throw up your shoulder and be like, well, I didn't write the rules. I didn't make the rules. I just have to enforce them. That's probably a better way to proceed than to enter into the realm of ad hoc or creating all these exemptions or exceptions. Now, in that domain, there are other areas whereby that's not appropriate. So our challenge, I think, is to look at some of these and to examine where we require something like this, where that's been a positive development. And I think safeguarding or the rules that are set up with respect to how church institutions relate with minors in their setting are on the whole a positive thing. There's probably examples that people could pull out and say that this one's stupid, and I might agree with them on that. I don't know. But I think that's a positive development of something that is similar to the kind of managerial ethos. But I think it's important that it doesn't define the whole organization. So to go back again to the example, I think this is to get to the heart of your question. This is the key thing, right? If we have a set of rules or a set of practices that makes it unable for the priest to exercise his role as a spiritual father, which will involve hugging children and will involve children treating the priest in the same way as they treat their father, which is to say they want to give their father a hug after they've done something well, scored a goal in a game, right? There needs to be the possibility for that relationship with the priest as well. It's going to be different, of course, but there needs to be some openness to that. And if you have a set of rules, if your managerialism throws up barriers to that, that's a real problem. And that's the kind of rule that should be expunged. With respect to an HR department, I think one of the things that we can ask here is a broad question, but it's something that we could look at, right? Is our concern against clericalization, for instance, is what we're doing when we're trying to bring lay people in? Is this just having them do the role that is associated with that which the priest used to have done, or the people who were close to the priest? They're just doing the exact same role, but we say, oh, it's a lay person, or is there a possibility of them bringing in a genuine new insight So one way I think of this is in theology, right? It's not a bad thing to have lay theologians. They can receive the training, and they can be very orthodox, right? Sometimes even more orthodox than the people who are in the setting. And having them involved in some of the process can be a good thing. But when we're doing something like saying, well, we have these altar servers. Now this is liturgical setting, and the altar server who used to be a deacon or someone who was in the seminary, well, that function could just be replaced by a lay woman, even perhaps. And that's good. We're declericalizing the church. That's a mistake, I think. So we have to be very, very, I think, very, very precise here about looking to what rules and what practices we're adopting from the world culture, which is the culture of managerialism, and asking what gets in the way of that. Do we need someone? The HR department is a good example of this, I think, in terms of the way that it's run, is to take the knowledge of business schools and put it to work in the Vatican. I think the first I forgot now the name, but first the first appointee, that was his background, and what is distinct here that helps the church govern in a better way. If you want to talk about the Vatican finances situation, well, maybe that needs some expertise, perhaps, from people who are involved in the financial world, right, to help improve that situation. But administration, done in the lines of your standard Western business school, what is distinct or innovative about that must essentially be brought into church governance? That's the one I'd be prima facie skeptical.
Well, it's so many of the priests that were, really talented priests in the Archdiocese of Chicago, were going to Kellogg Business School. I mean, it seemed like many of them that was, more important than going through the seminary. And so reading the latest textbook on management almost seemed to, prepare you better for the function of being I'm even calling it the function of being a pastor, than actually reading the spiritual masters. So I just want to ask you, in this now kind of like all-encompassing ethic, what does that do to authority? Because you just talked about it. There's a certain office that the Pope, sits in, and there's an authority that comes with that. And so, like, I mean, yeah, what happens to authority, particularly papal authority?
Yeah, well, I think this is the big question, and this is where I do see perhaps a providential aspect of the Francis papacy and the spiritual benefit, perhaps different in the way our initial commentator there imagined it. But when you have I think what we've discovered in as Catholics is the problem of exercising papal power in such down to the minutiae. The reliance on that, or the expectation of, I don't know I should think on this subject, I'll just look to what Rome says. The expectation that I'll put it like this, our habitual reliance on a kind of charismatic authority to define what Catholicism is, there's a problem there that we've come to realize. And so I think the benefit is that that's not actually part of the deposit of the faith. We don't need to have that model of a pope. It came about at a particular time. We were blessed for during the initial TV radio age with figures who were very good at that. I think Pius XII would be an example of that. John Paul II would be an example of that. Radio, TV, right? But we don't need that kind of example. We don't need that kind of figure to that kind of model does not necessarily represent the Pope. There are other models. So that's the beneficial side, whereby we've discovered the overuse of power has helped us see something about the nature of the Catholic faith. Here's the problem, though, I think, with the managerial side, and this is one of the points that I was more pessimistic in writing the essay, but also just in my own thinking. We're now at a stage whereby, because of that overuse, a lot of Catholics have gotten accustomed to just sort of when Rome does something, you keep your head down, just do what you've always done. Don't get involved. Don't read the documents because they're too confusing anyway, and it's too hard to make sense of what's going on. Not least because they're so long now, and so you kind of rely a lot on your own judgment, your own conscience, your own immediate circle of friends. In the next stage of the digital revolution, you rely a lot on the internet. None of those are bad things in themselves, but it's a displacement of authority from the traditional sources. So we're going to run, I think, into a position whereby it's going to be very, very tempting for figures who have lost their authority, not just the Pope, but also bishops, to use the language of managerialism in order not to rock the boat too much. If you're a bishop, you now have to manage this highly fragmented Catholic culture, where in a way, it's not just the simple or perhaps the familiar divides of a kind of Catholic culture wars about, say, I don't know, Humanae Vitae or something like that. It's not just a simple one like that. It's a very, very fragmented culture, and it's broken down. And so what's your temptation to handle that? Your temptation is just, well, let's just issue generic statements that aren't too controversial, don't look like we're picking sides too much. And so here we adopt the language of managerialism just in order to keep the peace, just in order to keep stability, in order not to have the flock fight each other or think, oh, the bishop's a rad trad, right? Or the bishop's a left-wing nut, like to fall into that kind of thing. And so this is, I think, a real danger, is in a community in which the figures who actually have authority, whose offices bear authority, have lost trust, have where the faithful have seen them exercise decisions in imprudent manners. The language of managerialism becomes a temptation in order to basically just keep things going. And so it's going to require, certainly don't envy the task of bishops or the next pope. It's going to require an extreme amount of delicatesse, of prudence, of caution in terms of how you make your pronouncements, how you engage with the flock in light of this new environment where your authority is not, I wouldn't say prima facie distrusted, I think that's a little too strong, but where you don't have as much authority as your predecessors did.
Do you think, Nathan, that's why, the Pope Francis's desire to seem authoritative is why he, started the whole synodality stuff? Because ultimately it appears nothing is going to come of any of that. But it was all process. And I'm still, I've read Larry Chapp, I've read, lots of people who are sort of trying to make sense for us what all of that means. And I still don't really know. It really just seems like a giant waste of time and resources. But it does seem like, reading your piece and kind of reflecting on this, that there was a great, it seems like it was a temptation too good not to take, in a sense, to like set something in motion like that to at least give the appearance of working on these questions, I suppose.
Yeah. So I think that's exactly right. I think that a lot of this is, and here the line of Archbishop Chaput really struck me, and I put it in the piece there, that this was heavy on the process. It just seemed to be emphasizing a particular process rather than anything really substantive. And that's, again, that's where one of these sort of telltale signs of managerialism. I think there are two ways of coming at this. Again, one could be, let's just keep the peace. We had perhaps a lot of liberal theologians, theologically liberal people who were expecting big things from this papacy, and wanted those documents to come out a certain way. And this was a way to kind of contain them, was to launch this synodal process that just didn't really seem to just distract them. So keeping the peace is one paradigm, but we shouldn't forget, I think, that managerialism comes with an ethic, and the ethic here is this conspicuous compassion, this tendency to lean towards the feel good, the sentimental, the subjective statements that you can't really object to, that you can't, that in the theological context are. It's not hard to square them with square remarks like that with Catholic teaching if you're talking generally about love and mercy, right? They're not objectionable statements. You can find ways to connect them with what the church has always taught, and yet, when that becomes the only mode of communication, when that's the major one, there's a lot that can get. Look, there's a lot that can be confused, or perhaps it's even interchangeable. But there's a lot that can be confused between what Catholic thought is and the religion of humanity. The two can end up looking exactly the same, talking exactly the same.
Yeah, no, I mean, I didn't put that together, the synodal way and this. It just seems so obvious. But I mean, maybe because I mean we're gonna wrap up here in just a little bit, but I mean, Pope Francis, it's kind of coming from it, looking at it from like the moral theology. It didn't seem that Pope Francis was too keen on some of the stuff that was said in Veritatis Splendor, that great encyclical by John Paul II, and you kind of found something like a proportionalism and kind of some things depending on the situation come to prominence under him. And particularly, I mean, since I went to the John Paul II Institute, what was done there with the particular moral theologians who were dismissed in that case. But it seems that all kind of, like you said, the ethic of managerialism and the kind of the therapeutic model that comes with that, it kind of seems like that all somewhat goes together. So this piece is excellent, Nathan, with helping kind of see this dimension, and I think that really is at the core of so much. So it's more of a comment, but and question.
Well, it's a great comment, and I think one of the things that perhaps I would have to think about more is whether managerialism and liberal theology is effectively the same thing. That the two go hand in hand. And one of the things that strikes me when you talk with liberal theologians is they're usually quite clear about the criticisms or gesturing towards progress, but they're not clear on when it would stop. Well, theological liberalism in the Catholic context looks a lot like, well, it would be great if we had a woman diaconate. There are, of course, more heterodox positions you could take, but that would be one where that's a little unclear in terms of it's not prima facie heresy is what I'll say to make that kind of argument. I think there are big problems with doing that. It'd be the wrong way to go, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not a prima facie heretical argument. You go into the Anglican setting, right? And what does liberal theology look like? There, it's way past women priests. It's on to women bishops. They're past that now. So it's unclear what the limits of that project are. And that's why a lot of it in practice looks just like this sort of vague gesture towards more sentimentality, more subjectivity, the kind of life coach ethos. And that goes a lot with managerialism. So yeah, all this is to say is I think it's an excellent comment. And I think the angle perhaps to think about more is whether liberal theology in the Christian context ends up just being synonymous with managerialism.
Yeah, just a final thought here, Nathan. We're recording this conversation when we have no pope. Pope Francis has died, and his funeral is tomorrow. We're recording this, I think, the day before his funeral, and so it'll be some time after that we'll get a new pope. I really want to applaud you for writing a piece like this, and others have written pieces like this, and not making your same point, but in a sense, like sort of flagging some things that they are concerned about from the Francis papacy as we're looking towards the next papacy. And there are critics out there who say, hey, look, let's just praise the man for what he did well. It's time to move on. We're moving on to the next thing. But I really do think we have a very small window right now where we can actually have pretty honest conversations about kind of the trajectory of the church here. And so, I'll just make that comment and just throw it back to you for any final words you want to offer.
No, exactly. I think we do need to, those of us who are informed laity and looking at these subjects need to think publicly about this. And it's, as you say, this is the moment to do that. I think that, I'm on the younger side, so I don't really remember what happened after John Paul II died. I do remember a bit after Benedict XVI resigned, but it does seem like at this moment there's a much harder look at how things have run. And as I said as well, I think a lot of Catholics realize it's not necessary. You can't just blame Pope Francis or say it all went wrong in the past 5 years or 10 years, even though there's quite a bit that went wrong. There's a longer term trajectory that we have to ask ourselves. What is the path that we've been on? What are some of the deep-seated trends that go back decades, go back generations, that may have revealed themselves in the past decade that we now have to take a very close look at and course correct? And I think that is what you say. This is one of the rare opportunities where we get to do that. And so those of us who are in the public square, as it were, or to the extent it still exists, but something like that should really do that. And so you commended me for the article. I commend you for running your organization as you do. I think for providing an occasion, a platform for people to do that, to reflect thoughtfully on that. So thank you for the service that you do for the church.
Well, thank you, Nathan. And I have to admit, I have to imagine that the men who are going into the conclave, who are creatures of this institution, have to be thinking along the lines of some of this managerial stuff. They have to be, because they're in it, And so I think what you flagged here for a lot of us who are kind of not in the institutions as deeply as the men who are going to be casting their ballot for the next pope, I would imagine some of this is pretty obvious to these guys who are going in there. So I wonder how that's going to affect their decision. We'll find out, I suppose. Any last words, Bobby?
No, I can imagine that's predominant in their minds. So I just pray that they have wisdom and guided by the Spirit. Yeah.
Well, on that note, we'll once again commend Nathan's article, Pope Francis's Managerial Revolution in Compact. It's I read it for free online, so I believe it's accessible to anybody who wants to go and get it. A compact subscription is not a bad idea. I had one, but I let it lapse, unfortunately. But I do think you can get that piece for free. It's a timely one. So, Nathan, again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And for all our listeners and viewers, we encourage you to check out our website, Spe Salvi Institute.com. Share this episode with a friend and sign up for our emails so you never miss anything that we do. Until next time, God bless and live in hope.